the UCLA, so forth. Again, no direct coordination of any of these activities. And this memorandum was basically calling for an effort to coordinate a lot of the different research activities so that there would be a reduced duplication and more efficient expenditures of monies. This was not an effort, as you suggest, to fight back against the health organizations that were generating information, but simply to conduct an efficient R&D program. And that's, I think, suggested on the next page of this document, where I was suggesting a way in which this might be done.
Well, when you talk about an efficient research and development program, in the paragraph I read earlier, you're talking about politics, you're talking about public relations, you're talking about many things that certainly have nothing to do with pure scientific research. Isn't that correct?
Well, the research is the basis, I think, of good public relations. I think research is the basis of political attitude and so forth. And I was calling for, I think, a highly coordinated, efficient, productive, targeted program.
To change the overall negative perception of the American public and the media and the scientific community toward the tobacco industry, right?
That would be part of the outcome of a good research program, yes.
Now, in a statement I read earlier, you know, your words, however, the public and political attitude toward smoking has seriously decayed with respect to the tobacco industry. What do you attribute that to?
Basically, statements that were being made by some of the public health folks, statements that were being made by the media, and a lack of public response from the industry.
Now, you make a suggestion on page 4 in the 4th paragraph. It is suggested that Council for Tobacco Research be combined with the Tobacco Institute administratively, and that an industry committee, along with the staff of the Institute and CTR, be designated to help define programs. Was your suggestion ever carried out to that effect?
No, it was not.
Do you know why not?
I think it was one of my poorer suggestions.
So in retrospect, you disagree with it?
Yes, I do.
Why were you suggesting it at that time?
I was looking for ways to be efficient administratively, and I'm looking for a combination of some of the different administrative functions into one. Again, looking for coordination. Trying to find suggesting a conceivable way that we could coordinate activity and reduce overhead.
What has been your connection with the Tobacco Institute?
None until I became a member of the executive committee and its board of directors.
Does that relationship continue up to the present time?
Yes, it does.
And when did it begin?
About a year and a half ago.
And well, what do you do in that dual capacity?
Dual capacity, I'm sorry.
Executive committee, board of directors?
Approve the budget of the organization, listen to general reports and generally activities of the organization from various division heads, basically approve the administrative actions, salaries, compensation, budget, that sort of thing.
Is the Tobacco Institute a trade association?
That's my understanding, yes.
And it's designed to accomplish what?
It is basically a lobbying organization in Washington, D.C., and coordinates some of the state-related issues that involve legislation.
Is it fair to characterize the Tobacco Institute as the spokesman generally for the individual tobacco companies?
Well, it certainly speaks for some of its members. However, some members have other spokespersons, so it's not the sole spokesperson.
Does Lorillard have any spokesperson?
No.
It does not?
No, just the Tobacco Institute.
Okay. So if Lorillard wants to respond to some adverse publicity or adverse science as it relates to the tobacco industry, you will do that through the Tobacco Institute?
We have that option, yes. We could do it otherwise as well.
Is the Council for Tobacco Research a trade association?
I would not characterize it that way.
In terms of your official position with the Council for Tobacco Research, are you familiar with how it characterizes itself on its federal income tax returns as to the type of entity it is?
I was made aware of that in a deposition. To that point, I was unaware of it.
You were made aware of the fact that it does characterize itself as a trade association?
I'm
I
aware.
object to the form of the question. You're asking him if that was proven to him or if that statement was made by some lawyer.
No. My understanding is that during a deposition, you learned that to be the case, learned that to be true.
It was represented to me by an attorney that that was the case. I don't know actually that it is the case from any other way or any other source.
Approximately when did that deposition take place?
I would say 3 or 4 months ago.
That was a deposition taken by who? Who was the lawyer who represented that to you?
Ronald Motley.
After the deposition, did you check it out in any fashion?
No, I did not.
To see if it was so. So,
No.
as you sit here today, you don't know one way or the other whether the Council for Tobacco Research identifies itself as a trade association in its federal income tax returns.
I don't know, but it certainly doesn't represent itself in that way. It represents itself as a grant funding organization for research purposes.
Now, what number are we up to? 11. Plaintiff's Exhibit 11.
Which one is this?
This exhibit is entitled Motives and Incentives in Cigarette Smoking, William L. Dunn, Jr., Philip Morris Research Center, Richmond, Virginia. Is this a document you're familiar with?
I believe I've seen it before, yes. Not that I see.
Now, this document refers to a St. Martin conference being called by the Council for Tobacco Research Were you at that conference?
I was at a conference in St. Martin, yes.
Okay. Now, on page 3 in the second paragraph, the document says the St. Martin Conference was called by the Council for Tobacco Research USA in an effort to goad the scientific community into having another go at the problem. What problem is being referred to?
I don't know.
What was the subject of the St. Martin Conference which you attended?
Smoking, motivation, and behavior.
Now, on page 4 of the document, but before I get to that, who is William L. Dunn, Jr.?
He was a scientist at Philip Morris.
How high up in the chain was he?
I don't know.
You don't know what his title was?
I don't know what his title was.
Okay. Now, on page 4, the second full paragraph, the majority of the conferees would go even further and accept the proposition that nicotine is the active constituent of cigarette smoke. Without nicotine, the argument goes, there would be no smoking. Some strong evidence can be marshaled to support this argument. Do you agree with that, what I've just read?
I don't know. He's reporting on what he believed the conferees said at the conference. And
do you accept that proposition that nicotine is the active constituent of cigarette smoke?
nicotine is an important constituent of cigarette smoke. And if we mean active by pharmacologically active, yes, it has some pharmacological effects.
Do you agree with his statement, without nicotine, the argument goes, there would be no smoking?
Well, we discussed that earlier, and I don't think there's much to support that. Only one instance that I'm aware of that a cigarette was made without, a tobacco cigarette was made without nicotine.
Well, isn't that a tremendous amount of evidence to support the statement that without nicotine there would be no smoking, since there's never been a successful commercial cigarette that didn't contain any nicotine?
I don't think there have ever been except one commercial cigarette, the base set on. And it was only a test market.
But all the cigarettes that are successful contain nicotine. Therefore, isn't his statement accurate that without nicotine there would be no smoking?
No, because that is a presumption that follows the idea that if you had cigarettes with no nicotine, there'd be no smoking, and there is no direct evidence of that, because there are no cigarettes out there that don't have nicotine.
Well, isn't the reason for that the fact that people in your position know that a cigarette without nicotine would be an abysmal commercial failure?
I don't think we know that.
You kind of suspect that?
No, I don't know. But I have said that nicotine is important, clearly. But I'm not ready to say that there'd be no smoking if there were cigarettes without nicotine. It doesn't follow.
He says some strong evidence can be marshaled to support this argument. Number one, no one has ever become a cigarette smoker by smoking cigarettes without nicotine. Now that's a true statement, isn't it?
Yes, because they had no choice.
Okay.
but I don't think it's an argument in support of his above hypothesis.
Number two, most of the physiological responses to inhaled smoke have been shown to be nicotine-related. Is that true?
That's true. Question is, how important are they?
Now, in number three, his first sentence is, despite many low nicotine brand entries into the marketplace, none of them have captured a substantial segment of the market.
That's true, but those are also cigarettes that have very low tar delivery and very low taste. So they're not simply a low nicotine, they are low tar nicotine. So we have two important characteristics in terms of the acceptance of a cigarette varying at the same time. They vary together.
And then on page 5, Mr. Dunn, in the second paragraph, goes on to say, the cigarette should be conceived not as a product, but as a package. The product is nicotine. The cigarette is but one of many packaged layers. There is the carton, which contains the pack, which contains the cigarette, which contains the smoke. The smoke is the final package. The smoker must strip off all these packaged layers to get to that which he seeks. Now, the paragraph that I've just read, isn't that truly the bottom line of what the tobacco industry is all about? Get the nicotine to the customer, and if he is satisfied with the nicotine content, he can become a lifelong customer, and obviously that's good for business.
No, I don't think that's quite right. I understand what he is saying, and he has his own view on this, and that, I think, is a innovative way to put this to the reader. But I think there is certainly information that nicotine is an important component of tobacco and tobacco smoking. Whether it is the sole reason that people smoke, I think, is not true. I mean, after all, remember that nicotine patches and nicotine gum are supplying nicotine, and yet people continue to smoke cigarettes. So if they continue to smoke cigarettes when they have supplemental sources or augmented or different sources of nicotine, to me that's satisfactory evidence that nicotine is not the sole reason that people smoke.
Well, isn't the sole purpose of that product, those products, to wean people off cigarette smoking, slowly, gradually?
It's the only instance that I'm aware of that you would give the so-called drug to wean people away. You don't do that with heroin, you don't do that with cocaine. Very strange in terms of an approach if this is truly an addictive drug. And I think that shows the ludicrous nature of it. You don't supplement or give people cocaine to wean them off of cocaine.
Have you ever heard of methadone?
Sure, but that's not cocaine.
What's the purpose of methadone?
Methadone?
Yeah.
Purpose is to try to block the active sites that lead to the addiction of the cocaine.
Did you or anybody else in the tobacco industry ever repudiate this document from Mr. Dunn?
I've never seen the
Morris?
document until long after that time frame when he wrote it.
When's the first time you saw this document?
I'm not sure whether I saw this in one of the early cases in which I testified or we provided deposition. It may have been.
Is Dunn a PhD?
Yes.
In what?
I believe psychology.
Now, he goes on to say on page 5, think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. It is unobtrusively portable. Its contents are instantly accessible. Think of the cigarette as a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. He's just telling it like it is, isn't he?
He is verbalizing something for whomever he wrote the memo.
Well, who did he write it for?
I don't, did it say? No. I don't know to whom he addressed this.
In terms of the various meetings you attended during the St. Martin Conference, were any of these kinds of views expressed, either by Dunn or by anybody else?
If they were, I didn't hear them.
Didn't William Dunn actually write a book incorporating these views?
He edited a book, which was basically a compilation of papers that were given at the conference, as I recall. I don't remember this particular view being in the book. But he does go on to say some other interesting things here in this memo.
Nicotine's a drug, isn't it?
Depends on your definition of a drug, but in the form of a cigarette, I certainly wouldn't call it a drug. As an independent agent, it would be a drug. The next page, I think, is interesting.
As an independent agent, it's a drug, but when it's put in a cigarette, it magically becomes something other than a drug.
Same as coffee. We don't call caffeine in coffee a drug. We don't classify it as a drug. But it is a drug if you take a capsule containing caffeine. It's not a drug in your soft drink. Depends on how you, what it's a part of.
Now,
and what the purpose is of it.
in the middle of page 6, Dr. Dunn says, smoke is beyond question the most optimized vehicle of nicotine, and the cigarette the most optimized dispenser of smoke. Do you agree with that statement?
Today, no. I would say that the nicotine gum and the nicotine patch are certainly more optimized dispensers of nicotine.
When you take this document as a whole, at least from Dr. Dunn's perspective, is it a fair characterization? The title of this document is Motives and Incentives in Cigarette Smoking. And Dunn is saying over and over again, the motive, the incentive in cigarette smoking is nicotine, 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 and anything else and everything else is trivial in comparison to nicotine. You may not agree with that, but isn't that what he's saying?
Well, I think he modifies by what he's saying here on page 6, which says, lest anyone be made unduly apprehensive about this drug-like conceptualization of a cigarette. Let me hasten to point out that there are many other vehicles of sought-after agents which dispense in dose units. Wine is the vehicle and dispenser of alcohol. Tea and coffee are the vehicles and dispensers of caffeine. Matches dispense doses of heat, and money is a storage container, vehicle, and dose dispenser of many things. To me, what he's done here is simply find a clever way, or what he's considered a clever way, to talk about nicotine and the cigarette. I don't think it says much of anything beyond that.
Well, then, another...
And he points out how he applies the same concept to a whole bunch of different things. And to me, it's, so what? So a match is a dispenser of heat. Money is a dispenser of many things. It's a container. I mean, he seems to be just using nice adjectives and has framed this in a way that is appealing to him as a writer anyway.
Yeah, but according to this, didn't the Surgeon General of the United States come out and say in 1988 and find that nicotine is addictive?
Surgeon General's report came out and made that statement, yes.
Okay, and the Surgeon General's report has all kinds of scientific advisors and medical advisors, and they all concurred in that conclusion. And would you not agree that since 1988 up until today, the general consensus, and certainly the majority of the medical and scientific community in the United States is that nicotine is an addictive substance?
Object to the form of the question. There's multiple compounds.
I'll try to answer the part of it that I think I grasp, but obviously to define something as addicting or addiction, one needs to define the term addiction. And earlier I tried to define that term in a reasonable way. The 1988 Surgeon General's report redefined the definition of addiction in order to bring tobacco under that definition, or nicotine under that definition, or specifically tobacco smoking. So it was not classified as addiction up to that point by Surgeon General report. As a matter of fact, an earlier report classified as an habituation. There was really no new data between these time periods, except the change in definition. So if you want to take a definition where many things become addictive, then you can certainly fit nicotine under it. But that's not, in my judgment, a reasonable thing to do.
Well, aren't we really playing word games with that answer? Because isn't the reality that the medical and scientific community accept the definition of addiction set forth in the Surgeon General's report of 1988?
You get a different definition almost in every document that you look at. If you go to the WHO definition, it's different from that one. So I don't think there is what I would consider a uniform definition that's accepted by, and the same in all of these documents.
Was this Go ahead.
I was going to say, and certainly in the public's mind, there are very different definitions of addiction.
How do you know it's in the public's mind?
Well, I looked at a book that was authored by someone with a PhD that came across my desk saying that we need to be concerned about urgency addiction. The word addiction is applied to just about everything. It's become a meaningless term if you do it in that way.
If someone has Berger's disease and he's losing fingers and toes, and his doctor tells him, you keep smoking. The reason you're losing fingers and toes is because you're smoking. And if you keep smoking, you're going to lose an arm, you're going to lose a leg. And he believes the doctor. And he tries to stop smoking, and he can't stop smoking, and he loses an arm, and he loses a leg, and he loses fingers. Would you concede that that person is addicted? Or he just doesn't have the willpower?
Wait just a minute, Doctor. Object to the form of the question. It's calling gross speculation.
I'm not calling for speculation at all.
I think you would have to examine the individual and find a comprehensive psychological exam and try to determine what the individual's problem really was. But you're telling me that this is a circumstance that if this were addiction, as you put it, that this individual couldn't use a nicotine patch, couldn't use gum, couldn't do anything but continue to smoke. That says to me it's not an addiction. There is something else that is aberrant behavior with respect to this individual. And to me, you would have to carry out a thorough medical exam and thorough psychological exam to try to determine what the best course would be with the individual.
Just like with the frank statement to cigarette smokers, we've got to do more research to figure out why this guy with Berger's disease, who's losing digits, who's losing his limbs, can't stop smoking when the problem is obviously he can't stop smoking because he's addicted. You don't have to do any more research.
Object to the form.
What research?
I wasn't suggesting research. I said you would work up a case history here and an understanding of that individual's problem. I do not accept the idea that he can't stop smoking if he wants to, unless there is some very serious abnormality with respect to that individual.
The abnormality is he can't quit smoking and he's losing his limbs. And in spite of knowing that he's losing his limbs because of smoking, he can't stop smoking.
I don't
Object to
accept
the form.
that.
Move to strike. There's no question pending.
You don't accept, even in the scenario that I've just described, you do not accept that that individual is addicted.
I do not accept that that individual cannot stop smoking.
There must be some deep-seated,
Well, I
either
don't-
psychological or medical problem that must be the explanation. And what that psychological problem is, or what that medical problem is, you don't know, correct?
I don't accept your hypothesis that this individual cannot stop smoking. And if indeed that is the case, then there are some other factors that are operative here that I'm unaware of. Because I don't accept that a normal individual can't stop smoking.
Okay. You hadn't said that before. Your view is that any normal individual, even if they're a 3-pack-a-day smoker for 35 years, can stop smoking on a dime without any problems, without any significant problems, if they make up their mind to do so. And if they can't do that, they ain't normal. Something the matter with them.
Object to the form.
Give you an example.
No, just give an example answering my question.
An individual who is a gambler, who spends his last money gambling, gambles away the paycheck, puts his family at sacrifice financially, severe sacrifice, will not stop gambling. Is that an addiction?
Absolutely.
The answer is absolutely no, it's not an addiction.
Absolutely it is.
Absolutely.
No, you're arguing that the witness.
Yeah, you asked me a question. I answered. Obviously it's an addiction. He can't help himself.
Well, then your definition of addiction is different than most everyone that I've seen.
My definition of addiction is what the Surgeon General of the United States, who is interested in the health of the American people, my definition is the same as his definition, as opposed to your definition, who's interested solely in profitability.
Object. There's no question pending, Dr. Spears.
Isn't that right? That's what you're the CEO and president of Lorillard. Your paramount concern is profitability, correct?
That is not correct.
No, is your paramount concern the health of the American people?
That is a very important concern. I've told you that our customers, our shareholders, community in general, that includes the health, these are all concerns.
And 43 years after, the tobacco industry, Lorillard included, promised the American public that you were going to spend millions researching the question as to whether cigarette smoking causes disease. 43 years later, on April 15, 1997, you're sitting in a conference room in New York City telling us that after millions and millions of dollars and 43 years, you are back where you were in 1954, saying it may cause disease, and maybe it doesn't cause disease. Doesn't that embarrass you?
Object to the form of the question, and it's a misstatement, a mischaracterization of the witness's testimony also.
I'm going to say that your mischaracterization embarrasses me. We're not back 4 years ago. There has been major advances in science, and there have been major advances in understanding of the diseases that are associated with smoking. To say we're back to the 43 years ago is preposterous. We are in today's environment. We have a much greater understanding, but we certainly do not have the understanding to say that smoking is a cause of these diseases. As for your statement about your definition of addiction a minute ago, that gambling is an addiction, that does not come under any of the definitions of addiction that I'm aware of. In terms of the reasonable definition I gave you, it's certainly not there, and I don't think it's there under any of the others in terms of Surgeon General reports.
Just, is that a note from the reporter? Are we within
5 minutes left?
No, this
No.
is an old.
Oh, all right.
How have I mischaracterized your testimony when you have told us throughout this deposition today on the issue of causation that cigarette smoking may cause lung cancer and other diseases and maybe it doesn't? Is that a correct or incorrect characterization of your testimony on causation?
My testimony on causation is that we do not know whether smoking causes these related diseases. It doesn't mean that it doesn't. We just don't know in terms of the information that is available to us today.
On that,
We are not back 40-some years ago in terms of our state of the knowledge.
on that limited, specific, direct issue, how is that any different from what the tobacco industry was saying in 1954 as to whether it knew or didn't know whether cigarette smoking caused disease?
Objection asked and answered.
In 1954, there was no replicated epidemiological studies that showed a consistent association with disease. There was one significant study at that time, as I recall. The rest was anecdotal type evidence. That has changed. There have been repeated epidemiological studies, and smoking has been consistently associated in these studies with the disease. And I've indicated to you that I accept that association as valid scientific work, but that alone does not prove causation. And to make the next step, there is required information, and I indicated what that would be. It would be animal inhalation experiments that showed tumors as they occur in human beings, or an understanding of the mechanism of the disease where one could explain the interaction of tobacco in that mechanism or tobacco smoking.
Do you agree with this statement? People get all kinds of levels of nicotine out of a cigarette depending on how they smoke it. It is not a regulated dose at all.
Within a certain range, yes, I agree with that. It's not a meter dose as Dunn suggested.
So depending upon the way a person smokes, a person could smoke a low-tar cigarette and get way more nicotine.
Sure, if you don't inhale one and you inhale the other, you get more nicotine. Or if you take one puff and put it out versus smoking the whole cigarette, or if you smoke 2 cigarettes and not one, there are all kinds of ways to get different
Are there
doses.
any measurements on that? That
On
kind
what?
of nicotine that people actually get into their bodies, as opposed to smoking machines?
Short term, yes.
Explain.
The only methods of making that measurement are to measure nicotine in the bloodstream and nicotine metabolites in the blood and better in the urine, collected over a 24-hour period. As the two methods, they both have problems in being very accurate in that nicotine disappears rather quickly from the bloodstream, and it can only be representative of the last few cigarettes that the individual smoked. And cotinine, which is a metabolite, does stay around for a number of days in terms of half-life. However, people metabolize nicotine in different ways, so the measurement of the metabolite is not a very quantitative method of looking at exposure. But within those kind of limitations, you can make those measurements.
Plaintiff's next numbered exhibit, 12. And which way read?
Mrs. Rosenblatt, is this one you...
No, that's one of the copies.
Thank you, I found it.
Now, this is a meeting of scientific directors in February 1968. The following individuals with indicated organizations met in Hilton Head, South Carolina for a 2.5-day meeting, and according to this document, you were present.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then in addition to the scientific directors, a lawyer from the firm of Covington and Burling was present at all the sessions. Is that correct?
That's what it says.
Okay. Do you remember that? Do you remember this meeting?
Generally, but I don't recall if this was the attorney that was present or not. But we would have had independent counsel to avoid antitrust potential issues.
Now, on the first page, the second paragraph from the bottom, our primary purpose was to discuss the scientific aspects of the problems facing the tobacco industry with specific emphasis on tobacco and health. If a consensus could be reached on this point, we were to discuss and attempt to reach a consensus as to an acceptable way to attempt to solve these problems. Solve what problems? Isn't the problem that's being addressed the problem from the tobacco industry's standpoint of the American public's perception that smoking was hazardous to their health? That was the problem.
Well, I'm trying to recall what the problem was. I think the problem was how to conduct, or if there was a way to be more efficient in the kind of research that was being conducted in the area of smoking and health.
Now, on the next page, beginning with the second paragraph, this consensus felt that an organization such as described below could probably be an effective mechanism, and the suggested name is Cigarette Research Institute, members open to all cigarette manufacturers, purpose to assemble, generate, and evaluate scientific information about cigarettes, cigarette components, smoking behavior, etc., of common interest to the membership. To make such information available to the member companies and further use as the membership may deem appropriate. We realize that many problems exist in the effective establishment of an organization of this sort, but we believe that none of these problems are insurmountable. Was this organization established?
Not per se, no. There was an organization that developed at the University of Kentucky called the Tobacco Research Institute of, I think, the University of Kentucky.
Were special projects discussed at this meeting as a mechanism of dealing with the problem?
I don't really know, but I don't think there was any discussion of special projects.
Does Lorillard have an employee handbook?
No. We have benefit books and that sort of thing, but there's not something we call an employee handbook.
Has Lorillard communicated to its employees, either in writing, by a pamphlet, by a memorandum, or orally, how they should respond to health attacks on their product?
No.
So there's been no direction from Lorillard as to how people should respond to the accusation that Lorillard products cause disease and result in hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's just up to each individual.
There's been no instruction to our employees on how to respond.
Have you ever seen this document before? This was marked yesterday, produced by Lorillard Tobacco Company, public smoking. Why don't you mark this? What number is this? 13.
No, I have not seen this before.
Well, in this document, which is a Brown and Williamson document, apparently, there are suggested answers to adversarial type questions, and you're telling us that Lorillard has never done anything like that.
I have no knowledge of Lorillard doing anything like this.
Mr. Rosenblatt, could you give us some idea on time? Is this a good time to take a break, a bad time? How much longer do you have?
Yeah, this is fine.
Okay.
His answers are very long.
Going off the record, 4:01. Back on the record, 4:12. Thank you.
The Broyne case, the flight attendant class action, is scheduled to go to trial in Miami beginning June 2nd. Do you plan on testifying live in that trial, as of now?
If I'm called, yes.
If your lawyer wants you to testify live, you will.
Yes.
Can you think of any document other than a frank statement to cigarette smokers, which was a collective document paid for by basically all the major tobacco companies and published during a given month in every major newspaper in America. My understanding is that the Frank statement is unique in that respect. What's your understanding?
I'm not aware of any other document by this industry, no.
Okay. Now, this is a document from out of this book, which you have a copy of. The title of which is Meeting of General Counsel on December 17, 1965.
David, do you have the copy for the witness of those, the ones from this book?
Pardon me?
I think the copies from this book you got. We didn't receive any copies from this book. We said we needed one for the witness.
Okay, I'm going to make a vote for fourth order with respect to this document. I believe this is going to I'm not 100% sure of that, but I will invoke the procedure under the court's order to seal the record with respect to the testimony concerning this document.
I'm not sure what you're asking me, Susan. I have a book with this document in it that he's referencing.
Right, and then we had a copy made of each document at the tab. I didn't get those copies, though. You may have gotten them.
I didn't.
Because they were for the witness, and ultimately for the exhibit.
All right, just a moment.
It would start with the Frank statement and then meeting of counsel.
I don't think I have that. My understanding was that, excuse me, I do have it.
This is document index as number 5 in your book. That's correct.
Correct, and what we'll do is we'll probably ask questions at the end of the deposition since you're asserting the privileges to that, just to separate it from the ones where there's no privilege asserted.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, then document 10, which is a letter to Professor Side from Philip Gaberman of an advertising agency. You've got that one also?
I have that one from your, oh,
From
yeah,
the book,
yes,
yeah,
uh-huh.
you've
I've
gotten
got that
those
one
copies.
too.
That's
Yeah.
not one of the privileged ones. No, that's a Lorillard document. Okay. So we'll proceed to that one. So that would be for the witness, and we have it in the book, and you've got it in the book. That's at tab 10.
Well, that's, this is not a Lorillard document,
Well,
but I know the one you're talking about, and I have a copy of it. You're saying you want my copy of these
No.
two documents?
that's for the witness.
Oh, all right. Okay.
And then you've got your copy at tab 10, and the witness can have your copy to refer to.
So do you want to have this marked then now?
Yes. Plaintiff's Exhibit 14?
All right, so the record is clear. We're moving on. Excuse me, go ahead. Shows the record's clear since we're moving on to a different document and not the one that was first mentioned. Not objections, not applied to document number 14.
Okay. Okay, the letter you've got in front of you is from a Philip Gaberman, creative director of a sales promotion agency in New York, and the letter goes to Professor Charles Side, and it is dated August 13, 1970. Now, the second paragraph on the first page says, "We have been asked by our client to come up with a package design a design that is attractive to kids, young adults. We were wondering if this project might serve as a challenging assignment for your package design classes. And then toward the bottom of the page, under C, the professor's being told the words, "a product of Lorillard, Greensboro, North Carolina, USA," must also appear. And on the second page, the statement is made, note, while this cigarette is geared to the youth market, no attempt, and in parenthesis the word obvious, no attempt obvious, can be made to encourage persons under 21 to smoke. The package design should be geared to attract the youthful eye, not the ever-watchful eye of the federal government. Have you seen this letter before?
I'm aware of this letter, yes.
Okay. Do you know Philip Gaberman?
No, I do not.
His agency was hired by Lorillard to do what?
His agency, I'm not sure, was hired by Lorillard. I had an occasion to look into this matter when we had a call from the Wall Street Journal where we obtained a copy of this letter. And in looking into this, finding was that Lorillard had no record in their files of this letter. We contacted an individual who was in charge of these sort of things at Lorillard, no longer an employee, by the name of Guberman, who denied that Lorillard had ever authorized such an activity. And then in an unrelated, in a unrelated case, legal case, we found that there was sworn deposition, sworn testimony, I think by Mr. Gaberman, that this was something that was, or by the head of the agency, that this was something that was not authorized by Lorillard and was undertaken apparently by this individual.
Just for the record, there isn't any slip of the tongue here. Guberman and Gaberman are different people. I don't want to intrude on your questioning. I'll be happy to state what our position is with respect to this document if you don't want me to do it, but you want to find out by interrogation, I'll leave that to you.
Well, you would agree that Gaberman's organization, his sales promotion agency, was retained at one time at least by Lorillard.
I'm not sure of that, but basically we think this was some effort on this agency's part to get business on behalf of Lorillard, and this was an initiative they undertook on their own, or this individual undertook on his own.
Well, on page 261 of your deposition, which was taken in the Florida Medicaid case, obviously a different case, August of 96, August 13, 96, on line 21, you were asked this question and gave this answer. Well, did Lorillard retain Mr. Gaberman, the creative director of this organization? Answer, his organization was retained on a different project, I believe, for a short period. So
that may be true.
Yes, okay. Well, one of the reasons you want to repudiate this letter is it's a pretty cynical letter, isn't it?
Well, as I say, it first came to our attention from the Wall Street Journal, and we had no recollection of this at all. And it was an investigation following that that the Wall Street Journal reporter brought this to our attention that we really looked into the matter. But as I say, no record of this in our files, and secondly, every indication that this is not a Lorillard-initiated activity.
I mean, it's obvious from that letter that what he's writing the professor about is coming up with packaging that will attract kids.
That's correct.
At tab 30. How about tab 31?
Yes.
36?
Yes.
So these are now the travel
All the rest of them are.
budgets.
Yeah, let me see this.
Are you going to something that you've given me a copy of, or am I working off?
No, we're going to keep the Brown and Williamson documents for the end of the deposition, so we're just going back to other areas.
At one time, Lorillard resigned from the Tobacco Institute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And why was that?
As I recall, it was over our wanting to publicize tar nicotine values for our true cigarette. And a general policy of the Tobacco Institute members, other members, that not to publish tar nicotine numbers over true advertising.
So why was that a concern?
I don't know why it was a concern, but I guess felt that generally this was not something that the industry was doing at the time in terms of publicizing tar and nicotine numbers for brands of cigarettes in terms of advertising.
And it was Lorillard's position that they should not be reported?
No, that we would report them as part of our advertising on true cigarettes.
What is the status of the grand jury investigation in Brooklyn, New York, of the Council for Tobacco Research?
I do not know.
You don't know if it's been closed or it's ongoing?
I do not know.
In connection with that investigation, wasn't Lorillard subpoenaed? Someone from Lorillard?
Not to my knowledge.
Right, referring to your deposition testimony in the state of Florida Medicaid case, which was taken August 13, 1996, in New York, page 62. On line 19, the question begins, has Lorillard retained counsel in connection with the Brooklyn federal grand jury proceeding? Answer, if Lorillard is named, they have in that grand jury investigation. If we have received a subpoena, which I believe we have, then we have retained counsel. When did Lorillard receive a subpoena? I don't know. Question, this year, last year, and your answer is, I believe, this year. So, at least when you gave that deposition, your best recollection was that Lorillard did receive a subpoena. And are you telling me today you have no recollection of the circumstances or the details concerning that subpoena?
At the moment, I do not recall a subpoena.
Has Lorillard ever been subpoenaed in any other criminal investigation?
Quite frankly, I do not recall.
Okay, on page 64 of the same deposition in the state of Florida Medicaid case, line 16, has Lorillard been subpoenaed in any capacity other than the Brooklyn tax grand jury investigation? Answer, yes. I believe Lorillard has received a subpoena in another grand jury investigation. Which one? I'm not certain, so I'd rather not say and be in error. So it's your best recollection that there was another criminal grand jury subpoena, but you don't remember the details.
Well, that's a mischaracterization of the witness' testimony. I object to that. He's testified to his memory. Now, what you've done is you've read something that he said earlier.
Correct, and now I'm asking if that refreshes your recollection about the other.
Well, I know that there have been grand jury investigations. To what degree we've been subpoenaed at the moment, I do not recall.
Now, you are aware, are you not, that there have been allegations by scientists who have received grant money from the Council for Tobacco Research that lawyers were editing out part of their research before they were allowed to publish it? Isn't that correct?
I recall that there have been some disputes with a couple of individuals. Whether that's exactly their assertions, I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, that is an incredibly serious charge, and as a member of the board of directors of the Council for Tobacco Research, was that investigated to find out if it was true?
Object to the form of the question. Move to strike the statement that preceded it.
You can answer.
Would you answer the question? I'm sorry.
I mean, that is an incredibly serious charge, and as a member of the Board of Directors of the Council for Tobacco Research, was that investigated to find out if that was true?
Again, I move to strike everything before as a member of.
It certainly was not investigated at the time that I was a member of the board. Whether it was investigated before that, I don't know.
Which individuals made the charges?
Well, I don't know. I said I don't recall the statement that you read to me. I know there has been a couple of disputes with investigators over time.
but specifically disputes relating to the fact that lawyers employed, paid for by the tobacco industry were attempting to edit out or change the substance of their published research. Those were the charges.
I don't
at least.
recall a specific allegation that lawyers did this. I do recall an individual who I thought just made the allegation that CTR staff had suggested changes in his manuscript.
And who was that?
I'm speaking of Freddie Homburger.
When were Kent micronite filters being advertised by Lorillard?
You can't use the term micronite filter from the early 50s until somewhere in the 1980s. The term micronite was used in connection with that cigarette filter.
And at one time, weren't those filters advertised as the greatest health protection ever developed for smokers?
This was back in the 1950s, yes.
That wasn't true, was it?
I think the data that they had to support that statement was true. They thought it was true at the time. And they had generated, Lorillard scientists and outside scientists had generated a battery of information and biological tests that led them to that conclusion.
Subsequently learned it was incorrect.
I would say yes, but certainly documented with respect to making that claim at that time.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, and according to many public health organizations, you will agree that they accept as a given their statement that cigarette smoking kills approximately 450,000 Americans every year. I know you don't agree with that, but that's their figure, correct?
That is a figure that they have calculated, yes.
You've read that many times in many different places.
So the number bounces around, but
Well, it bounces around between 425,000 and 450,000, and has basically been in that range for the past decade at least.
oh, I think bounces around more than that. I've seen 300 to 500.
Okay. And you would agree that in terms of the various public health organizations, that figure is accepted and repeated.
It's a PR statement that they make.
A PR statement?
Yeah, it's a
In what
sound bite that's used in the media.
Have you not seen, Dr. Spears, many articles written by many prominent physicians which have appeared in the most learned journals in this country, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, where in the body of the article, when the authors and the researchers are talking about a given study and they give background, that this figure appears, that cigarette smoking kills approximately 450,000 Americans every year?
When it appears, it's usually an introduction of the article. It's not a figure that is used with any real scientific support. It's just a figure published by the CDC. And if one looks into the data that's used to calculate that number, and all of the other risks that are associated with the disease, it becomes pretty obvious that it's a number that is not shrouded in good scientific procedures.
What's your number?
Don't have a number. I don't think there is a number.
And you like it that way, don't you?
Please let him
Well,
finish.
This number represents not a single death. This number represents a calculation based upon the epidemiological work. And it makes a host of assumptions. And you can test those assumptions a little bit by carrying out similar calculations for other risk factors using other risk factors that have been found to be associated with lung cancer, for example. And if you do that, you come up with many more people than could die in the United States. If you simply say, I'll calculate the number that would die from, let's say, excess fat in the diet, and I'll calculate the number based on the risk factor for excess fat. You continue to do that with all of the risk factors, dietary factors, socioeconomic, exercise, radon exposure, the numbers that are related to diet, as I said, dietary factors. Then you make these computations using these different risk factors. You quickly come out with numbers that are far in excess of deaths in the United States. So right then and there, you ought to be concerned with this kind of calculation. There is a very recent article by Isink who discusses this very thing, dividing people by personality types. And again, showing relationships between death and personality. And there's another one, another risk factor that you could take into account, certain types of personality. To me, it is not a useful number. It is a calculated number that is not based in science, but based on a risk factor calculation.
Then how come all the scientists accept it, except the scientists
I don't know
connected
that
with the tobacco industry?
I don't know that people accept it. I think it's published by the CDC, so people use it.
I want you to name one physician, one scientist in America who is totally unconnected with the tobacco industry, has never received funding from the tobacco industry, who has publicly said about that number approximately what you just said, which is that it's nonsense. That's your bottom line. The 450,000 that 450,000 Americans die each year as a result of cigarette smoking, your opinion is, and you've couched it in a very lengthy answer, but your opinion is that number is nonsense.
Object to the form
it's not
of the
real.
question.
The number is a calculated number. It does not have anything to do with actual deaths.
And I want to know, I want you to name for us one physician, one scientist who agrees with that.
And you excluded everybody that has ever done anything for the tobacco industry.
Yes.
Which leaves only one group of people, the American, which is the Public Health Service group and the anti-smokers.
Just give
There
me,
isn't anybody else.
give me what about just an average doctor with a private practice in hundreds of communities across America?
How would I know what his opinion is?
I would think that the tobacco industry would have an incentive to find such doctors so that you could say, hey, this just isn't my opinion, but I've got the name here of 7,000 general practitioners or board-certified doctors in internal medicine. It's not just me saying these numbers are nonsense. I've got these 7,000 doctors that are saying. That would be very impressive to the American people, wouldn't it?
Well, the doctor would have no way of knowing whether the number is right or wrong. It's a calculated number that requires mathematicians really to look at it.
How many Americans are killed by cigarette smoking every year?
That's an imponderable question. And nobody dies of cigarette smoking. They die of diseases.
How many Americans per year die of diseases caused by cigarette smoking?
I don't think any of them die of diseases caused by cigarette smoking.
Zero.
If they do, I think it's an unproven case. Now, I can't exclude the possibility, as I've said before. But certainly, I don't think you can conclude that X number of people die of cigarette smoking or the diseases associated with it.
Okay, so your number is zero. I mean, I just heard your answer, and I just want, your number is zero.
I think my numbers, I don't know if any do.
Okay. But on the other hand, since your testimony throughout the day has been that maybe cigarette smoking does cause cancer, and we know that a lot of Americans die of cancer, that if we carry that out logically, then your answer must necessarily be maybe a lot of Americans die from cancer caused by cigarette smoking. Isn't that logical? Maybe.
Well, I've said maybe, in the sense that I don't know whether tobacco smoking is a cause of disease. Until you reach that conclusion, it's a nonsensical calculation or nonsensical statement. Do people die of something that you don't know?
Indulge me.
Well, indulge me just a second.
Okay, I thought you were done.
You can sit and calculate the number of people who die of, let's say, cardiovascular disease, and say, okay, X number of people who eat eggs die of cardiovascular disease. Eggs cause the death of X number of people. Nonsensical calculations. What does it mean? You can do this about everything. It doesn't have meaning.
Have you ever seen an article in a medical journal which says, or put out by any public health agency in America, saying that X number of people die from eating eggs?
There are certainly articles put out that say people die from excess fat and cholesterol consumption.
Have you...
Eggs are a source. You can certainly make that calculation based on the number of eggs you eat.
Have you ever seen an article that specifically referred to people dying from eating too many eggs?
No, it's a ridiculous thing. That's what I'm saying to you.
And it's also, and it's equally ridiculous in your judgment for the Surgeon General and the U.S. Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control. It's equally ridiculous and preposterous for them to say that 450,000 Americans die every year as a result of cigarette smoking.
I think it's totally unsupportable. I think that it is a nice way to provide a warning to people to try to get them to give up smoking. And I think that has been the genesis of the number for that purpose, and then that's the purpose to which I believe it's being used.
On a logical basis, and I would like an answer to this specific question, you've said over and over again today, maybe cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Certainly you will concede that a certain number of people who get lung cancer die. Therefore, and you've said about your own father, that maybe his lung cancer was caused by his cigarette smoking. So my question to you simply is...
I think I said in that case I don't know.
Which means maybe. When you say you don't know, if something causes something, you have agreed throughout this deposition, I don't know means maybe it does and maybe it doesn't.
Move to strike.
Correct?
It's not a question.
Isn't that correct?
I have used the term maybe it does, maybe it does not. I cannot prove the negative.
Now I'm simply asking you, if maybe it does, which you recognize as a possibility, maybe cigarette smoking does cause lung cancer, therefore you have to agree, don't you, that maybe cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, which results in death.
Objection asked and answered repeatedly.
Is that correct?
I think the answer is that, as you stated it, if somebody contracts lung cancer and then they die, yes.
Would you agree that the New England Journal of Medicine is as prestigious a medical journal as exists in this country?
It's a prestigious journal.
Now, you testified during your 1994 deposition in this case that you read the two-part article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which appeared on March 31, 1994, and April 7, 1994. And I'm asking you whether you agree with the concluding statement in the journal article from April 7, 1994, which says as follows.
Hold on just a minute. Is this a document that I have a copy of?
Yes, that was Exhibit 2 or, I'm pretty sure. That was, yeah, those were the ones with the two green tabs.
All right, hold on just a minute, Mr. Rosenblatt. To speed this up, you want to show me the...
Page 980.
Why don't you show me the document, I mean the article, so I can see what I'm looking.
These were marked at the 94 depot. There's two parts. That and that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Hold on just a second. I've got that here somewhere. All right.
On page 980, these statements appear, and I'm going to read them to you and ask you at the end whether you agree or disagree.
Are you going to have this marked, Mr. Rosenblatt?
Yes. The two documents, so I guess this would be 15A and B. Sure, that's good. Okay, Dr. Spears, I'm quoting. Tobacco use has exacted a tragic toll on the United States population. Every segment of our society suffers the consequences of these addictive products, including disproportionate effects on children, women, and minorities. The human and economic costs of tobacco use to our society are overwhelming. A uniform ban on tobacco advertisements, an increase in the number of laws against smoking in public places, more aggressive public education, and a higher tax on cigarettes would diminish some of the human tragedies of tobacco use. You don't agree that, unquote, you don't agree that tobacco use causes any human tragedies, do you?
No, I do not.
To the 3-pack a day cigarette smoker who's laying at Sloan Kettering Memorial Hospital, dying a painful, agonizing death from lung cancer, your conscience is clear. It's got nothing to do with you, right?
I have total sympathy for an individual who has contracted lung cancer, suffering through that disease. But do I believe that cigarette smoke has been shown to be the causative factor in that disease? The answer is no.
And
And
therefore,
certainly not on, as you talk about individual cases, no.
and therefore, well, whether I'm talking about individual cases or collective cases,
Well,
if I gave you a whole hospital ward of lung cancer patients who are all heavy smokers, your answer would be the same, whether it's 100 or whether it's 1.
No, I'm saying that risk factors or associations don't really relate to individuals, they relate to groups.
But in any event, your conscience is clear.
My conscience is clear, yes.
Even though maybe,
I can say,
even though maybe the person laying in the hospital bed dying of lung cancer from smoking the cigarettes, maybe that agonizing death was caused by the smoking, according to your testimony. Maybe yes, maybe no.
we can raise the maybe about anything. If you're a food manufacturer, maybe it was because of the food you processed.
Since your position is, and Lorillard's position is, that the scientific studies on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer do not prove causation, then how can you assert that the public should know that it does?
Well, I object to the form of the question. I think that mischaracterizes the witness's testimony.
Well, when you say that you've said earlier in the deposition that the American public is well informed, they know the health consequences of smoking, and since you take the position that the scientific studies are all defective and don't prove causation, how can the public be well informed on that subject?
Again, same objection. I don't think the witness testified.
Then it's a new
counsel's
question.
indicated.
Then it's a new question.
I think what I testified to is that the risk factors are well recognized by the public. I accept those risk factors, and the communication of those communication of risk factors to the general public, and that has occurred in a more dramatic form than that by the media and by the Public Health Service, by the Surgeon General. Almost what I would call a media blitz. You see tobacco in the newspaper almost every day. To suggest that the public is not informed about tobacco smoking being a risk factor or associated with disease, to me is, I just see absolutely no support for the idea that they're not informed.
Well, but suppose they have your view. Sure, it's a risk factor like eggs.
They are perfectly free to accept that view. Why not? That's an individual's view.
Now, the segment that I read to you from the New England Journal of Medicine from April 7, 1994, which were obviously some very strong statements talking about tobacco use exacting a tragic toll on the United States population and primarily upon women, children, and minorities, which I know you reject. But the authors of this article are Thomas D. McKenzie, M.D., Carl E. Bartecci, M.D., and Robert W. Schreier, M.D. Have you ever heard those names before?
No.
Do you have any reason to believe that they're anti-tobacco zealots?
I don't know.
They are from the Department of Medicine, the University of Colorado School of Medicine. What's their agenda for making such a strong statement against your industry?
I don't know what their agenda is, but they certainly use adjectives that are elicited to, or used to, I guess, elicit emotion.
Well, I want you to assume that all three of these doctors have treated patients who died as a result of cancer, which they were convinced was caused by your product, by cigarettes, and they cared for these patients, and they feel they died prematurely, and the only reason they died, from their standpoint, is they smoked cigarettes. Would you not agree that some emotion and strong language is justified to try to prevent other people from suffering a similar fate?
You haven't shown me the article, and I don't recall it clearly as to whether it's an editorial or a scientific paper. But it's basically, it's an article that has no data in it, as I can see, other than opinions. It's called a special article and is an opinion article. And I guess they have written in a way that is to elicit attention for their article. It's not typical of a scientist writing, which is usually without these kind of adjectives.
if the ongoing research related to tobacco and health, and this is obviously hypothetical, because I know you're not convinced now, but if the scientific data became so impressive that you were convinced, you know, for years you took the position maybe cigarette smoking causes disease and death, maybe it doesn't, but now you're convinced it does. You're absolutely convinced of that. Would you get out of the business, quit your job as president and CEO of Lorillard?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances surrounding your hypothetical question. Some of the questions you would ask is, first of all, what is this precise evidence that we're talking about? Secondarily, does a product remain a legal product from a governmental point of view? Is there still a demand for the product? There are a lot of considerations that I think would have to go into that, which are all imponderables under the hypothetical that you've given me.
Well, I want you to assume that every scientist in America, every medical doctor in America, and you are convinced that cigarette smoking causes cancer and death. Yes, it's still a legal product, and yes, some people still want to buy cigarettes. And my question to you is, would you get out of the business or would you remain in the business?
And my response is still, I think, without knowing all the factors that would be present in reaching that decision and have an understanding of these, it's really not an answerable question.
What is there to know? I'm telling you in the hypothetical that you have become convinced by the scientific evidence that your Kents and your Newports cause disease and death. And I'm asking you, having been convinced of that, would you get out of the business? And you're telling me you need more information?
Sure. I would like to know the data that is supposed to be convincing me of this and what it specifically says, whether the product remains a legal product, as I said, whether there's a continuing demand for the product. There are certainly products sold in the United States and elsewhere that carry a risk with them. Certainly everyone doesn't get disease. We understand that. It's not a fait accompli. If you had proven this and you were a smoker, that every smoker gets this disease. So there are a lot of imponderables here that are not easy to answer in the hypothetical. And I don't think you can give an answer to that question without knowing all the facts that would exist at that time. Certainly getting out of the business would be one possibility, and it should be evaluated.
And when you said in giving the answer, you'd want to know whether there's a continuous demand. So therefore, if there was a continuous demand, even though you were convinced that your product causes cancer and death, you would have to consider whether you would continue selling your product.
No, I was saying in the context, if there was no demand, it wouldn't make any sense to be in the business. I mean, that would answer the question. You'd be out of it.
Yeah, because you couldn't make any money.
Well, if you can't sell the product, then there is no decision.
But if there is a continuing demand and you can make money selling the product, even though it causes cancer and death, you might very well remain in the business.
And if it's a legal product and so forth and so on, that would be a consideration, yes.
That's all I have.
Going off the record, end of tape 3, end of deposition, 5:07.